So our first theory on human behavior in the psychological theories is a psychodynamic perspective. So um, anyone who's taken a psych class has heard of Freud, and he is really at the heart and soul of the psychodynamic perspective. And so it's very much about those internal conscious or unconscious drives to kind of take care of ourselves. So essentially, if you had to summarize what the psychodynamic perspective is, it's concerned with how internal processes such as needs, so like hunger, need for relationship, kind of those basic needs, our drives and our emotions motivate our behavior. So one of the things that is at the forefront of the psychodynamic perspective is that emotions do have a central place in human behavior. And so we cannot rely on logic fully or our cognition, that our emotions sometimes can be unconscious and they'll drive how we navigate life. So it kind of ties on to number 2, where unconscious as well as the conscious mental activity serves as the motivating force in human behavior. Freud, in his original interpretations and applications of psychodynamic perspectives, really focused on how childhood really set the stage for how people behave further in life. And so some of that, like attachment styles, being able to have a bond, specifically with the mother. There was a lot of focus between children and child and mother relationships. And so really looking at how needs were met early on then dictated kind of the pattern of an individual and how that was then played out into the rest of their life. And so if you're thinking about how childhood is kind of the origin of the psychodynamic perspective, the concept number 4 of individuals who may become overwhelmed by internal and external demands, think about a child aren't necessarily able to process and navigate large, big problems. And so becoming overwhelmed by problems can sometimes manifest into some really maladaptive behavior. So if a child isn't able to express when they're feeling overwhelmed, they might have temper tantrums, which can be interpreted as acting out when really they're just trying to communicate something as being overwhelming in their environment. If you've taken a psychology class, you have to, within the social work program, there's a lot of talk about the id and the ego, and how those internal and external drives are in competition with each other. But really, we're not going to get into the details of though with this. We're just giving a very brief overview that we use. It's looking at using some of those defense mechanisms to avoid becoming overwhelmed by some of the internal feelings or the external demands that come along with life. So a nice little visual to look at the psychodynamic perspective, so you can see that every individual comes with needs and drives and emotions. These are often, per this perspective, formulated during early childhood experiences and patterns within the family. And so the individual's needs, drives, and emotions often influence directly how we process things cognitively, so very logically and very with our cerebral side, and then affectively, which is more of the emotive side. And then you can also see that these are influenced by external demands and stimuli, so things that aren't necessarily going on inside. They can also dictate how our processes are going. So they can be conscious, kind of unconscious, not unconscious, and processes that are still developing. And then that dictates our human behavior. Strengths of this is it's actually a very measurable perspective because you're kind of looking at emotions and direct connections. There is the very cognitive piece of it, so you can really look at identifying emotions and drawing the lines between feelings and trauma or incidents that happen in childhood. There's a lot of concrete pieces to it. And it does pay strong attention to emotions, which is often at the forefront of any therapeutic relationship. And it incorporates biology into people's functioning. So it's looking at kind of that holistic approach. Time is considered, so person, environment, over time. But a large chunk of it is actually spent sitting in childhood. and not much consideration to new things that might occur in adulthood. And it does have a strong recognition of parent and child power dynamics. So this could also like go hand in hand, utilizing this and the conflict perspective at the same time. Some of the weaknesses is that some of it is kind of archaic. Freud developed this a long time ago, and there wasn't a ton of understanding about different concepts with the psyche, and so it might seem a little bit outdated. There has been some movement to take the concepts and tweak them a little bit or look at them through a different lens. So it doesn't always take into a lot of consideration power dynamics in gender. It's got a heavy male bias within it. So there have been offshoots of this theory to kind of look at it more through like a feminist lens and more cultural lens. But historically, it has been very biased towards white males. Although it's measurable, it can be seen as vague and abstract, and that kind of is where you're focusing more on the emotions and kind of the internal unconscious processes that you can't necessarily see or identify. Environment doesn't have as many dimensions that we like to look at, and it really just focuses kind of like on family or some of those dyad relationships, especially the mother-child one, which can sometimes develop into some mother blaming for maladaptive behaviors of the child. And because we live in a society where the mother role looks very different than when Freud was around, mothers are in the workplace more, they're not necessarily the primary caregiver, that might not necessarily be as translatable to current situations. So what does the psychodynamic perspective bring to the social work profession? It can really help us assist our clients in expressing emotional conflicts because it does take into consideration people's emotions. And it ties back into the past, and so you can have some reflective healing possibly about, like, I might be acting this way because of things that happen. Now let's figure out how to navigate that. So that does help with development of self-awareness and self-control. And there's a lot of emphasis on the provider eliciting information out of the client. So it does have this really celebratory view of the professional and client relationship as someone who works together and kind of uses that relationship of exploration as the motivator to change.